It began on a rainy Thursday in Montpelier, Vermont, the kind of cold, persistent rain that makes everything feel heavier. I was supposed to be working late that day. Inventory audits at the shop were behind schedule, but my body disagreed. A pulsing headache and damp socks from a midday downpour convinced me to clock out early. I didn't tell Caroline I was coming home. I thought I'd surprise her, maybe cook something simple, open a bottle of that dusty Pinot we never touched, and talk like we used to. But instead of comfort, I walked into the beginning of an unraveling. I came through the back door, dropping my soaked jacket onto the bench, kicking off my boots. The house was quiet, too quiet for mid-afternoon. No TV, no music, not even the dull hum of her podcast voices that usually floated through the hallway. Then, upstairs, a sound broke the stillness. A loud, sudden thud. Not accidental. It was sharp, rushed, deliberate. Before I could react, I heard hurried footsteps moving across the floorboards above me. They weren't normal paces, they were quick, like someone trying not to be caught. I froze in the mudroom. Then came a door creaking open. A second later, a slam. The back staircase. That door was rarely used, leading out to the old screened porch that faced the narrow alley behind our home. By the time I opened the porch door, there was nothing. Just falling rain, the distant bark of a dog, and an alley empty except for a few puddles reflecting the gray sky. No figure, no car pulling away. But something was wrong. It was in the stillness. I turned back inside and locked the door behind me. I took one breath, then two. She was already in the kitchen by the time I reached it. Caroline. She stood barefoot in her robe, damp hair framing her flushed cheeks, her face a little too composed, like someone rehearsing calm. She wasn't wearing the leggings and hoodie I'd seen her in that morning. Her robe was loosely knotted, revealing a glimpse of bare skin underneath, and her eyes, reddened at the edges, told a different story than her mouth would offer. She looked like she had been crying, but there was no sign of sadness in her voice when she asked why I was home early. She started explaining before I could say a word. Something about a Zoom meeting gone badly. A coworker had gotten fired, or maybe it was personal. It was all so vague. She gestured vaguely toward the living room where her laptop sat closed, as if proof lay there waiting for me if I needed it. She claimed she had been overwhelmed, that she'd needed a moment alone. She said she'd tried on a few perfume samples that a friend had sent her from New York, scents for a product test. That's what I must have smelled, she insisted. Not cologne, not a man, not what it smelled like, but the scent lingered, sharp and distinctly masculine. I'd never smelled anything like it on her before. It didn't match her delicate preferences. Nothing floral or herbal or even clean. This was darker, woody, spiced, familiar in a way I couldn't quite place, and entirely wrong for her. I nodded, pretending to accept the explanation, even offering a thin smile as she poured me coffee with hands that shook only slightly. I didn't challenge her, though every part of me itched to ask the obvious questions. Why had the door slammed? Why were there footsteps? Who had been in the house? Why did it feel like I'd walked into the middle of something I wasn't meant to see? Instead, I accepted the moment for what it was, a moment not to fight. I sipped the coffee, pretended to believe the lie, and watched her avoid my eyes. I chose silence not out of kindness, but out of calculation. Not because I trusted her, but because something in me wanted to see what would happen if I didn't confront it. If I just waited. That night, I lay awake next to her. She fell asleep quickly, too quickly, her breathing deepening as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. My mind replayed the day with unsettling clarity. The footsteps, the slammed door, the perfume that wasn't perfume, the red eyes, the robe that looked too recently thrown on. I stared at the ceiling and imagined a different version of that moment. One where I'd been 2 minutes earlier, where I would have seen whoever had slipped away through that back porch. But I hadn't. I was too late. And now, I had only the leftovers of suspicion. In the morning, I made breakfast. She acted as if everything was normal. She kissed my cheek as she left the house for her studio. I watched her walk away down the steps, her heels clicking lightly. There was no mention of yesterday, no further elaboration. just routines perfectly preserved. But from that moment on, I started noticing everything. I became a man cataloging his own life, times, sounds, smells, absences. I paid attention to her phone now, always face down, always silenced. I paid attention to her showers that lasted just a bit longer, her sudden bursts of laughter at text messages she didn't show me. I noticed how she'd started wearing perfume again. Different ones, new ones, samples, she said. Always samples. But none of them ever smelled like what I'd walked into that day. Some might call it paranoia, but paranoia is fear without foundation. What I felt was rooted, real. It had a scent, a rhythm, a shape, and I was tired of pretending not to see it. In the days that followed, I began reviewing everything, not consciously at first, more like a reflex, the way your tongue keeps finding the sore spot in your mouth. I moved through our house like someone sifting through a story already written, only now reading it for the second time and seeing what they missed. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It dripped in, slow and steady, like the rain still falling that week, filling up the spaces in my memory that I had once let her explain away. I remembered the walk she took late on a Tuesday 2 weeks before. She said she needed air, solitude. I'd offered to join her, but she gently refused, said she needed space to think through a design concept. I thought nothing of it then. But that night, she came back breathless, cheeks flushed, her hair damp, not from sweat, but mist. And she had no sketches, no notes, just silence and a vague smile that said nothing at all. Another moment surfaced. The weekend I was away for a trade show in Albany. She had declined to join me, citing exhaustion and deadlines. I'd left early Friday morning and returned Sunday night. The house looked untouched. Beds too neat, kitchen too clean. Even the trash cans were empty, and she had barely touched the food I had stocked before leaving. She told me she'd spent most of it curled up reading. But something felt off. Her energy had changed. It was like I'd interrupted someone else's rhythm when I walked through the door. And then there was the incident with the envelope. A slip of paper tucked into an open envelope on the kitchen counter. I caught a glimpse of unfamiliar handwriting before she swept it up and stuffed it into her bag with casual urgency. She claimed it was an old receipt, something unimportant. But the lines I saw didn't look like itemized numbers. They looked like words, a note, something personal. She always said she hated secrets, that transparency was the foundation of any relationship. I used to believe that, until I started noticing how often her phone never left her side. Even when she showered, it came with her into the bathroom, tucked carefully beneath a towel on the vanity. She claimed it was for music, for podcasts, but the screen never lit up with sound. Just messages, notifications she glanced at too quickly, or turned off before I could ask. Her behavior wasn't loud. It was subtle, surgical. She didn't lie directly. She left space for assumption and filled it with charm. And I, stupidly, had played my part as the believing husband. I had interpreted silence as peace. I thought that the absence of conflict meant everything was okay. But now I saw it differently. Silence wasn't peace. It was distance. And she had been curating that distance for a long time. Even her scent had changed. For years, she wore light florals, jasmine, rosewater, sometimes a hint of bergamot. But lately, she smelled different. More mature, heavier. Leather, musk, smoke. When I asked about it once, she'd said she was experimenting with Eunice *X notes, testing new blends. At the time, I admired her creativity. Now, I wondered who she was testing them for. There were other shifts too. She started declining plans we made together. A dinner with my sister, a game night with friends, even our usual Saturday hikes. She always had reasons. Work, fatigue, a headache. At first, I accepted it as a phase. But the excuses multiplied, while the energy she once reserved for us began showing up in other places. She had new stories about people I hadn't met, colleagues with names I hadn't heard before, projects I didn't know she was part of. When I asked questions, she answered, but never with detail. It was like chasing mist. Every answer evaporated as soon as I reached for it. Even our shared spaces began to reflect the growing fracture. The bedroom became hers more than ours. She rearranged furniture while I was at work, moved books to shelves I couldn't reach, replaced our bedding with a minimalist gray set that felt cold against the skin. Her studio door stayed shut more often. I wasn't forbidden, but I was no longer welcome without notice. Once, I knocked and heard hurried shuffling, papers being moved, perhaps. She emerged a minute later, flustered, holding a sketchpad and asking if I needed something. And yet she smiled. Every day she smiled. A perfect, practiced expression that now felt more like a shield than a reflection of any shared emotion. I couldn't shake the memory of that Thursday. The footsteps, the door, the scent, the robe. But what haunted me most was how well she recovered. How quickly she resumed normalcy. That night she made dinner. Shepherd's pie. My favorite. She poured wine and lit candles, saying she wanted to bring some warmth back into the week. I watched her across the table. The curve of her lip as she described a client call. The way she gestured with her fork. Everything was there, yet nothing was real. We didn't argue. We didn't accuse. But something fundamental had shifted. Like the floorboards under us had splintered, and we were both pretending not to hear them creak. One night, I stayed awake long after she drifted off. Her breathing was slow and even, and I found myself studying her face in the moonlight. There was nothing hostile there, just detachment. She was no longer the woman I knew, or perhaps I had never truly known her. Maybe I had been looking at a reflection of what I wanted to see, not what was actually there. I thought about checking her phone once. She had fallen asleep on the couch, and it buzzed softly beside her. My fingers moved toward it, hovering for a second too long. But I stopped. Not because I feared what I'd find, but because I already knew. Whatever was going on had moved past doubt. The weight in my chest wasn't suspicion. It was recognition. She wasn't hiding from me anymore. She simply wasn't including me. In the morning, she made us matcha lattes and kissed my shoulder like nothing had changed. I played my role, nodding, sipping, smiling faintly. But something inside me had calcified. My love for her didn't vanish, but it transformed. No longer something that reached toward her. Curled inward, self-preserving. Quiet. I started to watch more. Not her behavior, but her patterns. When she left. When she returned. What she wore. What she avoided. I even started writing things down, not to use but to understand. A journal hidden in my desk drawer, buried beneath old tax folders. Times, dates, phrases. Everything she probably assumed I had missed. I noticed the way she always seemed to be waiting for something after texting, how her expression would change for a beat and then reset, how her laughter, once spontaneous, now came delayed, like she was translating it from another conversation. And when she canceled our Lake Tahoe trip, something we had planned for months, that's when it all solidified. She said she didn't feel up for it, that the mountain air wouldn't help her work stress. But she didn't seem stressed. She seemed excited. She lit candles that night, played soft music, and poured herself a glass of red wine. I watched her from the hallway as she moved around the living room in a long sweater, swaying slightly to the music. Alone. Or maybe not. I stayed in the guest room that night, told her I had a headache. She didn't argue, didn't even follow. I stared at the ceiling, my hand on my chest, breathing slowly. I didn't need a confrontation. I didn't need proof. What I needed now was clarity. And clarity, finally, was beginning to arrive. Some truths don't need to be spoken. They reveal themselves in stillness, in the gaps between words, in the patterns no longer disguised by routine. And sometimes all it takes is one quiet decision to finally see them as they are, not as we wish them to be. It was a Wednesday when I took the day off without telling her. I didn't do it out of spite or suspicion, it was more like instinct. I woke up early, dressed quietly, and left the house before sunrise. I needed space, not answers. I spent the morning at a cafe on the edge of town, my phone face down on the table, watching people come and go. It was calming, almost meditative. But beneath the surface, I was waiting. At 2:12 p.m., I received a message from Caroline, heading downtown soon. Meeting at 3. We'll be back later tonight. Don't wait on dinner. Love you. I stared at it for a while. Meeting. She had grown fond of vague terms like that, words that suggested work but promised no detail. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened a rideshare app and searched her account. Something I'd only done once before, when she had asked me to book a ride for her during a snowstorm. Her most recent trip was scheduled for 2:45 p.m. Destination: Maple and River Hotel. I knew the place. It wasn't flashy. Boutique, quiet, tucked behind a street of overpriced wine bars. Not exactly a spot for boardroom meetings or client workshops. The name sat on my screen like a verdict I hadn't asked for. I closed the app without breathing and walked to my truck. By the time I parked across the street from the hotel, the sky had turned a pale shade of silver. The streets were wet from the morning rain, glistening like glass. I waited with the engine off, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting on my lap. The silence in the cab was heavier than anything I'd felt in weeks. At exactly 3:08 p.m., Caroline stepped out of the rideshare car. She was wearing a navy coat I hadn't seen in months, belted tightly at the waist, her hair pulled back in a neat twist. It was subtle elegance, deliberate but not flashy. She looked around the street, quick glances over both shoulders, then adjusted the strap of her bag and walked through the hotel's glass doors without hesitation. I didn't follow immediately, couldn't. Something about seeing her there, in that context, took the breath out of my chest. She wasn't running from anything. She wasn't unsure. She moved like someone with a destination and a rhythm already practiced. Like this wasn't the first time. I waited 15 minutes. Just long enough to make sure it wasn't a misunderstanding. Just long enough to give myself the opportunity to turn away and pretend. But I stayed. At 3:26 p.m., a tall man arrived. He walked down the sidewalk with the casual confidence of someone who didn't need to check street numbers. He carried a weathered duffel bag slung over one shoulder, wore a dark gray hoodie with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, and tattoos peeked from both forearms. Ink that crawled from beneath his sleeves like vines. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't nervous. He knew where he was going. When he stepped through the doors, I didn't move. But inside, something settled. The final piece. The image of her entering. Then him. The duffel bag. The body language. They didn't embrace. There was no kiss. No overt gesture. But as the glass doors closed behind him, I caught a glimpse. Her hand reaching for his, fingers lacing briefly through his before they disappeared from view. That was all I needed. The moment wasn't dramatic. There was no punch in the gut, no collapse in the chest. It was quiet, cold. A calm realization that this was no longer speculation. This was no longer theory stitched together by doubt. It was confirmation. Simple, complete, irreversible. I didn't sit there stewing. I didn't scream or hit the steering wheel. I just watched the street, the glass door, the movement of passersby who had no idea what had shifted in my world. At 4:10 p.m., I started the truck and drove home. The roads were wet again by then. The wipers moved slowly across the windshield, the only sound aside from the low hum of the engine. I didn't call anyone. I didn't think about what I'd say when she returned. There was nothing to plan, nothing to confront. Some things end not with words, but with the quiet acknowledgement that words wouldn't matter anymore. Back home, I changed into dry clothes and sat in the kitchen. The same kitchen where she had once told me about her dreams to design a sustainable garden in the backyard. The same space where we used to play music while cooking together. The same room where, weeks earlier, she had fabricated an emotional Zoom call, wrapping it in work talk and perfume. I sat there for hours. I didn't touch my phone. I didn't open my laptop. I just watched the shadows shift as the day collapsed into evening. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, each sound a reminder of the normalcy I had lived inside for too long. By the time the sky went black, I wasn't thinking about the man or the hotel room or even the betrayal. I was thinking about how easy it had been for her, how natural, and I wondered how long she had been living in that dual world, one version of herself for me, and another for someone else entirely. She didn't come home that night. No message. No lie about meetings running late or last-minute dinners. Just silence. And for the first time, I didn't wait up. I didn't pace or check my phone. I simply turned off the kitchen light, walked upstairs, and closed the door behind me. In the quiet of our bedroom, I lay on my side of the bed and stared at the ceiling. The sheets smelled like her, but the scent didn't comfort me. It irritated something deep within, a reminder that my trust had been spent on a ghost. I slept lightly, waking every hour to the sound of nothing. And when the morning light spilled across the floor, I knew I had changed. Not in anger, not in heartbreak, but in position. I was no longer clinging to a version of the life I thought I had. I was watching it drift away, and realizing I no longer had the need to swim after it. She came home the next day as if nothing had happened. She walked in with 2 coffee cups and a pastry bag from the bakery on Main Street. She wore the same navy coat, and her hair was still pinned. Her tone was casual, light. There was no sign of shame, no lingering anxiety. I didn't ask. She placed a cup in front of me, said something about almond milk and how the line was long. I nodded, thanked her, sipped, tasted normal. Everything about her return was curated for normalcy. But everything had already broken. I smiled faintly, out of habit, and moved on with my day. She talked about her meeting, the presentation, the cafe where she stopped afterward. I listened the way you listen to a television show playing in another room, aware, but disconnected. And so began a new silence. Not the kind filled with dread or confrontation, but a silence that understood. A silence that no longer searched for answers, because I had seen enough. There are moments in life when you expect impact. A crash, an explosion, the audible break of something once whole. But sometimes, endings don't come with noise. They arrive in silence, soft as dust settling after a storm. That's how it was for me. The day after I saw Caroline enter the hotel, everything remained outwardly the same. She made breakfast, I read the news, we exchanged pleasantries. But something unspoken had entered the space between us. It didn't scream or demand acknowledgement. It simply existed, permanent, undeniable, and alive in the quiet. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask questions or pretend I hadn't followed her. I didn't need to. The truth, now fully visible, had rendered confrontation meaningless. Accusation required the pretense of doubt. I had none left. What remained was observation, pure, still, and unflinching. We lived beside each other like parallel lines, close but never touching. Every part of our routine continued, but none of it felt shared. We ate meals at the same table but not together. She spoke of her day, her clients, her ideas for a new workspace layout, but never asked about mine. When I offered a response, she smiled like someone nodding along to a podcast they weren't truly listening to. Our home became a museum of what used to be. Shared photographs on the wall, once and asterisk-mate objects collecting dust. Blankets folded neatly on the couch neither of us sat on anymore. The record player in the living room stood silent. The stack of jazz records we used to cycle through sat untouched. She used to dance in the kitchen while I cooked, small, unplanned movements. Now, she moved with deliberation, efficient and impersonal, like a houseguest trying not to offend. In the evenings, she often retreated into her studio, sometimes for hours. The door would close gently behind her, and I could hear the faint tapping of her stylus or keyboard through the wall. I never entered. The space had become hers, and mine had become everywhere else. I began taking walks in the evening, long ones, winding through streets I didn't know well. I didn't tell her when I left, and she never asked where I went. Sometimes I walked aimlessly. Other times I found myself at the same cafe, sitting alone with a book I barely read. I wasn't looking for clarity anymore. I had already found it. What I sought now was quiet. Not silence, the kind we shared, but actual quiet, the kind that allows a person to begin hearing themselves again. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It was charged, alive with everything unsaid. I could feel it when I brushed past her in the hallway and neither of us acknowledged the contact. I felt it when our eyes met across the table and both of us looked away. We weren't fighting. We weren't making amends. We were enduring. And yet there were small, strange moments. Once, I sneezed while reading in the den, and she called "bless you" from the kitchen. It startled me. Not the words, but the casual kindness in them. Like muscle memory. A reflex from the version of us that used to be. Another night, I heard her laughing softly in her studio, her voice low and genuine. It wasn't a laugh I recognized. It belonged to someone else, someone she had become in a life just beyond my reach. I stood outside the door for a moment, listening, wondering who was on the other end of the conversation. But I didn't knock. I just walked away. She still brought groceries, did laundry, folded my shirts. At first, I wondered if it was guilt, some form of penance. But it didn't feel like that. It felt habitual. A performance of care without the emotion behind it. I tried to remember the last time she touched me. Not out of obligation or routine, but because she wanted to, couldn't. One Saturday morning, I found her outside watering the plants. She wore jeans and an old hoodie of mine, her hair pulled into a messy bun. She looked normal, like the version of her I had once fallen in love with. I watched her through the window for a few seconds, wondering if she was pretending, too, or if maybe, for a moment, she had forgotten. Forgotten that the wall between us had become permanent. That afternoon, I reorganized the garage. It had been months since I'd gone through the old boxes. I found a stack of photo albums buried beneath a dusty tarp. Our honeymoon, our first house, birthdays, barbecues, vacations. I sat on a stool and flipped through them, one by one, like a visitor in someone else's life. We looked happy, real. But even in those stills, I could now see it. That slight edge in her smile, the way I leaned toward her more than she leaned toward me. I wondered how far back the distance had ***n. Maybe it had always been there, and I had simply filled the space with hope. That evening, she made dinner. Pasta with sage butter and mushrooms, one of my comfort dishes. She plated it beautifully, set the table with candles, and poured us each a glass of wine. I almost asked why. Why pretend now? But the question felt irrelevant. We ate in near silence, clinking silverware the only soundtrack. When we finished, she offered dessert. Store-bought tiramisu. I accepted, mostly out of politeness. She watched me as I took the first bite. I nodded. She smiled. But the warmth in that exchange was artificial. Two actors bowing at the end of a performance neither of them believed in anymore. Later that night, I found myself sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. She came in from the bathroom, paused at the doorway, and asked if I was okay. I told her I was tired. She nodded, turned off the light, and climbed into bed. We lay beside each other like strangers, breathing the same air, feeling the same weight in the mattress but a universe apart. At some point, she reached over and rested a hand lightly on my back. Not a gesture of affection, more like acknowledgement, like pressing her palm against a memory just long enough to say it still existed. I didn't react. Neither of us moved again for the rest of the night. In the morning, she got up early and made coffee. I found her sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling her phone. She looked up and smiled. "Morning," she said. I returned the greeting and sat across from her. We drank in silence, steam rising between us like the last remnants of a story fading into smoke. I didn't bring up the hotel, or the man, or the hand-holding, not because I'd forgiven her, but because what was broken didn't require confirmation. I wasn't seeking apology or justification. I had moved beyond that. What I wanted now was space. Not physical, but emotional. I wanted my mind back. My energy. The parts of myself I had been spending trying to hold something together that had already dissolved. In the weeks that followed, I learned how to exist beside her without needing her. I made my own meals when I felt like it. I went to the movies alone. I picked up new books, new habits, walked new paths through town. I began remembering what solitude felt like. Not loneliness, but sovereignty. It felt like climbing out of a fog. She didn't question the change. Or if she did, she didn't show it. Maybe she was relieved. Maybe she had been waiting for the confrontation, and when it never came, she adjusted. We became shadows of ourselves, peaceful, distant, quietly coexisting. There's a strange kind of **Macy in that distance. in knowing someone so well that you can read every pause, every avoidance, every calculated gesture. We stopped speaking about real things, but our silence said more than any fight ever could. Said, we know. We're both pretending, and neither of us is ready to be the one who ends it. But something had ended already, and now it was only a matter of time before the rest caught up. Sometimes change enters the room without knocking. It doesn't explode. It doesn't warn. It simply arrives, subtle and quiet, like light shifting across the floor. For me, that change came in the form of a woman named Allison. It started with a flyer folded inside a neighborhood newsletter. Home chef, kitchen reset, weekly comfort meals, flexible hours. I'd skimmed past it at first, but that evening, while cleaning out the junk drawer, one of the only spaces still truly mine, I found it again and paused. I wasn't hungry for food. I was hungry for something different, some kind of pulse, a reminder that energy still existed outside the cocoon of silence. Caroline and I had spun around ourselves. I sent a message that night. 2 days later, Allison arrived. She was younger than me by maybe 10 years. Efficient, focused, cheerful, but not in an invasive way. She wore her hair in a loose braid and moved through the kitchen with a rhythm that was practiced but warm. She didn't ask questions beyond what she needed. Just walked in, unpacked a canvas bag of herbs and produce, and began cooking. First, Caroline said nothing. She came home that evening, looked at the fresh scent in the air, the clean countertops, the organized spice rack, and simply raised an eyebrow. "Trying something new?" she said with a thin smile. I didn't reply with more than a nod. That became the first unspoken rule. I wouldn't explain. She wouldn't ask. Allison came twice a week, Mondays and Thursdays. Each visit, she cooked enough for several meals, labeling containers, arranging them neatly in the fridge, leaving behind a brief note with reheating suggestions. I liked the order she brought, the way she hummed while chopping, the way she cleaned as she moved. It wasn't about attraction. It was about contrast, energy. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum of broken words when she was in it. Caroline noticed. At first, she hovered, just outside the kitchen doorway, pretending to be looking for something on the bookshelf or organizing the mail. Then, by the third visit, she stepped in, offered to help peel carrots, commented on the smell of garlic. It was strange, watching the two of them interact. Caroline, who had barely looked at me in weeks, now smiling and asking where Allison sourced her produce. I watched them from the hallway. Once, unnoticed, Caroline stood by the stove, asking questions she already knew the answers to. She wasn't curious, she was performing, testing something. Allison, for her part, didn't seem fazed. She answered plainly, never overstepping, never stepping back. The dynamic shifted again the following week. Caroline came home early, unannounced. I had just gotten in from work, still pulling off my boots, when I heard laughter from the kitchen. Not Allison's alone, Caroline's too. Genuine laughter, high and unrestrained, like the echo of a version of her I hadn't heard in months. I entered quietly. They were baking something, muffins, maybe. The counter was dusted with flour, and Caroline's sleeve was smudged with chocolate. She looked lighter, younger even. She turned and noticed me, her smile faltering only slightly. She said nothing, just held up the muffin tray as if offering proof of her own presence. I nodded, said I'd be upstairs. And I was, but I didn't close the door. I sat at the top of the stairs and listened as they talked, about food, travel, work. It was small talk, mostly, but **made in a way I hadn't shared with her in months. Something about it unsettled me, not jealousy but displacement. She hadn't shared laughter like that with me in a long time. And now, here she was, laughing with someone who didn't even know our story, who hadn't watched the silent collapse of what used to be a marriage. Over the next few visits, Caroline remained involved. Sometimes just hovering, sometimes joining fully. They made cookies once. Another time, Caroline showed Allison her herb garden, pointing out mint leaves and the struggling lavender. They weren't becoming friends, not exactly. But there was a strange alliance forming, a slow merge, and I found myself stepping further back. I no longer lingered in the kitchen during Allison's visits. I'd come in to taste something when asked, maybe offer to wash a dish out of courtesy, but I mostly observed from the edges. Caroline had taken quiet ownership of the space again, not through declaration but through presence. I wondered if this was her way of reclaiming something, of reminding me that she could still command attention, still draw people in. But it wasn't me she was trying to reach. It was the energy Allison had brought, and the mirror it held up to the version of herself she hadn't seen in months. It was surreal watching her become animated again. She started playing music while cooking, something soft and upbeat. She opened the windows, even when it was cold, letting the scent of rosemary and thyme drift out into the crisp air. The kitchen, once a graveyard of our failed rituals, was alive again, just not because of us. One Thursday, I came home early. Allison had just left, and Caroline was alone at the sink, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing a pot. The scent of sage lingered. She didn't look up when I entered. I poured myself a glass of water, stood in silence, then walked out. She didn't call after me. That was another unspoken rule. We didn't chase anymore. That night, I found a note in the fridge from Allison. Hope you both enjoy the stew. Added extra fennel this time. Let me know if you want me to switch up the Friday menus. I read it twice. You both. It struck me, not painfully, but with a kind of distant clarity. To her, we were a couple. Still functional. Still joined. To us, we were something else entirely. Later that week, Caroline made a request. We were sitting in the living room, each on separate ends of the couch, the television playing some documentary neither of us was watching. She cleared her throat. I think I'll take over the cooking again. I turned to her. She didn't meet my eyes. It's not that Allison's not great. She is. But I've been feeling disconnected from everything. I miss it. The kitchen. Creating. Nourishing. I don't want to feel like a stranger in my own house. I nodded once. There was no fight in me,